Artist and activist Judy Seidman is a strong believer in the power of art as a tool to address social issues. As part of the Kulimani support group, Seidman leads workshops in order to expose the truth about the atrocities committed by the apartheid government. She uses visual expression to shine a light on prevailing human rights issues around abortion and reproductive rights. She was a strong voice in the early years of the HIV and AIDS pandemic, creating posters and educational material for the ANC and other health-based organizations and non-profit organizations at the time when stigma and misinformation about the condition was running rife. Seidman has found the process of creating art cathartic in dealing with her own HIV-positive status, a condition she's lived with for more than 25 years. Today, the struggle for women with you continues. Tell us about your Kulimani art and memory workshops and the sort of things that you've learned from women, for example, whose husbands were killed in Marikana in this supposedly free South Africa.
First, let me say that the art and memory work, which I've also done with gender groups, by the way, particularly in relation to Women's Month, I need to mention that. That approach to art came directly out of Medu. People who are in categories who have been suppressed, and women have undoubtedly been suppressed, and their perspectives on what's happened to them, even on how you see your own body, has been changed, distorted. Nearly all of the pictures that we see about women are made by men about women, and they don't tell our own stories. They don't begin to tell our own stories. So one of the things that we started to say was, how do we get people to use the visual arts to tell their stories? Exactly as we did in Medu, talking about national liberation.
And I suppose sometimes it's easier to tell your story through art rather than vocalizing it, a different way of vocalizing it.
I think different people do it better different ways. Yes. I mean, obviously, the spoken word has its own.
Yes. Yeah.
What we do find is that if we get people to draw about their own lives, it sort of forces them out of the automatic concepts that they've got, which are very often verbal. Yeah. So if you tell somebody to draw a picture about what were the things that affected you, even if they don't feel they can draw, they will see it completely differently than if you ask them what happened to your life and they say, well, I grew up and went to school and I got married and...
Yes, and they got encapsulated on that.
It's the headline story that you're taught is that these are the good things in your life or these are the things that happened in your life. Whereas if you ask them to draw it, they start thinking about it differently.
And is that cathartic too?
It's cathartic. It's definitely cathartic. One of the other things that comes out of the Medu experience is that some of the main techniques that we use in the workshops actually do come from psychological art therapy. The idea of body mapping, which is you draw an outline of the body and then you draw into it the things that you want to talk about. It was originally, I think, it was an art therapy approach. The difference between the way we handle it and the art therapy approach is that, firstly, we do it in groups as workshops. After we've done the pictures, we ask the group to talk about it as a group. So it's not just you and your therapist trying to deal with it. It's also, what am I saying about what's happened to me that may or may not speak to what's happened to you? But one of the things that I learned from Medu was the belief that art is actually a means of communication. It's if you like, it's a social glue. It's a cultural glue. And if we don't tell our own stories, nobody else is going to tell it. Or there's a wonderful quote from the American poet Audre Lorde, which says, I'm going to misquote it, but it says roughly, if I didn't tell my own story, somebody else is going to put it in their mouth, chew it up and spit it out, and it's going to come out all wrong.
Yeah. Talking of stories, I believe you were watching some beautiful dancing, and I forget where it was now, I read about it, And at this stage, you were suffering from HIV/AIDS, which you've had for over 20 years.
Yeah.
What sort of impact did that have on you, seeing that and allowing you to tell the story and how you've seen your fight against the epidemic?
All of my artwork and all of my, if you like, responses to life is now expressed in artwork. At least I hope it is. I try. I actually did a picture that's titled Dancing with in the Epidemic. And that was actually done because I went to a disco thing when I was feeling particularly bad. And just watching men and women dancing and the way they moved around each other and thinking how this whole discourse at that point, AIDS was seen as a blight upon sex or on gender, and something that killed you, and there was no recovery from it as well. And trying to think about how this affected how we interacted with each other. So there is a picture that does that. I don't know how well.
So, AIDS is obviously still a massive problem in South Africa. We're one of the worst. The infection rate goes up, and we have the abortion problem. I know two things that obviously mean a lot to you. Why are we still getting that so wrong?
I don't think we've dealt with patriarchy. I think one of the things that happened in the liberation struggle for me was it gave a space for women to raise these questions as part of a broader liberation movement, and it was raised. I mean, one of the things about Meru, even given, shall I say, even given that the majority of my comrades were male, and they had their own prejudices and male chauvinism sometimes, not all of them by any means, and some of them were wonderful, but there were people whose names I'm not going to go by name, who probably needed some lessons along the way. But at least there was a recognition that women had a story to tell and that they had to find ways to get it out. And when we started talking about gender, and particularly when it was clear that some of these gender issues hadn't been dealt with properly in terms of the post-1994 solutions, it seemed obvious that art might be a way to help people to look at that. But one of the things we found is we've done workshops with women's groups on abortion. In fact, the first ones we did were helped spark the current movement for getting abortion back on the table in South Africa.
Congratulations.
Because one of the things we found out was that if you're poor in a township or in a rural area, your chances of getting the free abortion that was promised to you were close to nil. And the statistic we were given at that workshop, which was not at that stage publicized, was that there was over 90 deaths a month from failed abortions in South Africa. That was 3 years ago.
And you can imagine what they'd have to go through to have these abortions.
Yeah. Well, they were mostly illegal or self-generated or partial abortions with the medical, the pill abortions where they don't give you the full dosage, things like that.
And I should imagine it hasn't got any better if you look at what's happening in the country today. I mean, you had those conversations years ago, and yet we are still struggling with patriarchy, with the lack of respect towards women. Do you think the fact that women's issues weren't really acknowledged throughout the TRC's hearings
was a major issue? So to get back to Kulamani, one of the things that came up when we started working with Kulamani, we started to do workshops with Kulamani members. Now, Kulamani, as you may know, was originally set up to support people going to the TRC. After the TRC closed down, it continued to expand and, of course, discovered that many, many people never got to the TRC. And so we had this process for a couple of years, thankfully funded by the National Lottery, where we went to and ran workshops in different provinces with Kulamani members talking about what made them qualified as Kulamani members, which meant what were the human rights violations that they'd experienced and gone through. So everything from Sharpeville to Zamdela to we did workshops in Kerman, outside Kerman, and some in KwaZulu as well. And what we were finding is, from the very first ones we did, that the women there were the ones who never had told their stories anywheres. And their stories around gender particularly were completely suppressed. So the very first workshop we had with Kulamani was in Polo Park in 2007. We did this whole workshop, like a 5-day workshop of drawing pictures. And at the end of it, we put the pictures on the wall and talked about them. And there was one picture of a woman sitting in a chair with blood, saying, "I'm asked to forgive, but I don't think I can," whatever. She had written that. And it looked like it might be a picture about gender violence, about rape. And I said, nobody's mentioned the word rape here, but this was after 5 days of workshop. But this picture makes me think of it. That workshop had 12 people in it, 9 of them were women. 4 of those women came up to me afterwards and said they had been raped by police or soldiers in Polo Park literally as a political act in the 1990s, including my co-facilitator.
And that's just a group of 12, so you can imagine how
they had not
prevalent
talked about it just because the TRC had said that rape wouldn't count as a political act, possibly because there was a feeling that it was too personal and too, how did you define it as a personal act? So you wouldn't, the TRC agreement was the perpetrator would confess to the incident, the crime, and then they would get amnesty. And presumably the victim would get some kind of reparation. But if they weren't accepting that this was a political crime, you wouldn't get amnesty. Therefore, nobody ever talked about it. Therefore, there was no reason for women to go up and go through the trauma of talking about it if it wasn't going to go anywhere. So they didn't.
Okay, so the legacy of apartheid and so much misjustice in the TRC. And where do you think it's left women today? Obviously, you're working with so many of them scarred.
Those women themselves say that even today, if you go into a police station in Polo Park or in Katlehong and say you've been raped, they cite incidences of somebody saying, "Oh yeah, didn't you claim that once before?" You think we're going to take it seriously now?
Often they verbally
and this is, 15 years later.
Yeah,
it's still like that. And the fact that they never even were able to talk to their own children about it. There was one case we had where, in the Eastern Cape, where the woman's daughter was 15, was gang raped and murdered. And the woman actually was saying if she had been able to talk to her child about what happened to her, maybe it wouldn't have happened like that. But she obviously blamed herself for not being able to pass it on. And it's just, over and over, this is one thing that's been repeatedly mentioned.
When it comes to women and the sort of condition they find themselves in, the sort of abuses they face today, is there any hope?
I would have said there's lots of hope, and maybe should say that the hope for me rests in those women themselves, because women are beginning to do things for themselves. I should just say I've just finished doing a workshop with a group of women who organize themselves to oppose gender-based violence, particularly in Everton. And they have organized women to demonstrate outside courts of femicide cases, of rape cases, and so forth. But in this workshop, they painted this amazing mural that goes right the way around the office that they use in Everton. that shows women supporting each other, women helping each other in the face of the dangers that face them, that offers them shelter, that shows women demonstrating outside the courts. I think that women like that are actually beginning to find the answers. Okay. And yes, there's a political point that has to be made as well.